Bonjour, Anine, and welcome to the 12th installment of our 2021 GLEAR-TRUST virtual seminar series. My name is Kira Harshaw, and I'm a master's student in environmental science at the University of Windsor.
And Anine, my name is Allie. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Communication at Wayne State.
And we will be your hosts for today's seminar.
So to begin, we'd like to acknowledge that the University of Windsor and Wayne State University sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, Anishinaabeg, Peoria, Miamia, and Mississauga Nations.
We, as the Windsor and Wayne University communities, would like to move beyond acknowledgements, and we would like to not only give our respect to the traditional territory we are on, but also commit to learning and growing, starting with our partnerships and collaborations moving forward.
This is our second to last seminar of this year's series. We are excited to announce that our last seminar will be a lightning talk style panel featuring students from both the GLEAR and TRUST graduate programs. So we look forward to seeing you hopefully on Friday, April 9th at 10 a.m. for our student research showcase. And please stay tuned for more information to come in the next couple of weeks.
Today, our panelists will be discussing and taking questions regarding the role of communication in engaging communities on environmental and justice issues in climate change, sustainability, and other ecological challenges.
So I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping now and just share some of our Zoom ground rules. So everyone who is not a panelist, if you're not already, please ensure that your microphone is on mute and that your video is off. So if you could just take a second to check, go ahead and mute yourself, make sure your video is off. Your chat facilitators for today are Galara and Chelsea. So please send your questions through them at any time during this panel discussion. They will pass them along to Kira and I for the Q&A portion of the seminar. The talk will be recorded and posted online at a later date. And we would like to ask our technical team just to make sure that's recording, and it looks like it is. And then just to let you know how this will be formatted for about the next 90 minutes. The panelists will each introduce themselves and just deliver an open-ended discussion, which will last for about an hour. And then the panel will run a little longer than it normally does for just a single speaker, because we are going to allow or ask early career researchers to stay for the Q&A portion, which will last for about another 30 minutes.
All right, so we'd like to start by giving a brief introduction of our speakers for today's panel. Our first panelist is Claire Sanders. Claire Sanders has been with the Essex Region Conservation Authority for over 7 years, first as the Remedial Action Plan Coordinator for the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup, and now as the Climate Change Specialist. In these roles, she facilitates partnerships and helps identify work plans and engagement activities for the many individuals and agencies needed to address the regional ecological challenges that are too complex to be addressed by a single organization alone. She holds a master's degree in biology and a Bachelor of Education from the University of Windsor and currently resides in Kingsville, Ontario.
Right, I will introduce our next panelist, Dr. Bridie McGreavy. Dr. McGreavy is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of Maine and a faculty fellow with the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. She studies how communication shapes sustainability and justice efforts in coastal shellfishing communities, river restoration and freshwater conservation initiatives, and transdisciplinary collaborations. Dr. McGreavy is currently chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Maine Shellfish Restoration and Resilience Fund, which provides seed grants to shellfish harvesters and municipalities for coastal adaptation efforts. She serves as the project lead for the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, a coast-wide initiative to support learning, leadership, and equity in Maine and Wabanaki wild clam and mussel fisheries.
Our third panelist is Dr. Carol Miller. Dr. Miller is a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Wayne State University. Her passion for environmental, human, and ecological health in the Great Lakes watershed has framed her career for the past 35 years. She founded and is the director of Healthy Urban Waters, a multidisciplinary group of researchers focused on urban water and its relationship with human health. She is also co-principal investigator for the new One Health initiative, launched in January 2021 to catalyze environmental health research by looking through the lens of animal, plant, ecological, and overall planetary health. Her doctorate is from the University of Michigan in Civil and Environmental Engineering.
And our final panelist is Justin Onwenu. Justin is a Detroit-based environmental justice organizer for the Sierra Club, a major American grassroots environmental organization that aims to improve environmental stewardship and sustainability, as well as public awareness of environmental issues, among other goals. As a community organizer, Justin has been working with communities, policymakers, and other local groups to protect critical drinking water resources and aquatic ecosystems from contamination, as well as to secure access to clean air and water for all members of communities. Justin is also an appointee to the Democratic National Committee's Council on Environment and Climate Crisis and is an inaugural appointee on Michigan's Council for Environmental Justice.
We'd like to ask you as the audience to join us in giving our speakers a warm welcome. If you can, please turn on your cameras now and give a short wave. Okay, thank you everyone. You can turn your cameras back off now. We'd like to extend our thanks to our panelists for the opportunity to hear about their knowledge and their experiences. And we'd like to give them the floor now to kick off our discussion. To start with, would each of you please provide us with more detail on your organization, work, or current projects, particularly related to engaging communities on environmental issues?
Shall I start? Since I was the first on the list, I can go first. Thanks so much for the introduction. And can you hear me okay? My sound good? Thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And quite honestly, when I reread the ad last night and I saw that this was, it said something about communications experts, I was like, oh no, what have I gotten myself into? So I'm really excited to hear actually from the other panelists, and I've got my pen ready to learn from everybody else today and from your experiences. And certainly, I wouldn't classify myself as an expert in communicating climate change or environmental sustainability in our region, but I've certainly had an opportunity to work with a number of expert communicators. I'm bringing teams together for all of our projects to develop messaging on engagement strategies. So I'm drawing on some of that experience as well, and really just my passion and my interest for the health of the region. So again, my name is Claire Sanders, and I'm the climate change specialist for the Essex Region Conservation Authority, also known as IRCA. And IRCA is one of 36 conservation authorities, and conservation authorities are in the province of Ontario. And we're empowered through provincial legislation to further conservation, restoration, development, and management of natural resources, not including coal and gas and oil. So conservation authorities are uniquely organized on a watershed basis, which means that we cross municipal boundaries, and so environmental decisions can be assessed on the basis of their impact to the entire watershed. So it makes us a little bit unique within Canada as well. So one of our roles is to support and comment on natural heritage planning and ensuring nature and ecosystems are diverse and in good condition and connected to each other is one of the things that we do on the landscape. So every year, IRCA plants somewhere between 50,000 and 130,000 seedlings. And of course, all of these things, ensuring our ecosystems are in good condition, these are all also climate actions. So these are really things that we've been doing for decades with our community and engaging the community in these types of actions, including tree planting and other stewardship events and education programs. And so recently we started really an actual climate change program. And as a regional agency, we really have the ability to facilitate sort of region-wide studies and projects that impact everyone. So we have nine municipalities within our jurisdiction. And so with 7 of those municipalities outside of the city of Windsor, we're helping to establish a roadmap for greenhouse gas reductions and economic development in the region. So it's a bit of an unusual role for a conservation authority, where you might think more of sort of adaptation actions and floodplain mapping. But, you know, we saw a need in this region, and that was something that we were able to help do. So we're really in the midst of doing that and developing communication strategies around how to engage the public and our elected officials in our mitigation plan. So again, we're also undertaking a number of other projects, including floodplain mapping and adapting our forestry program and all of those things. And I would suggest that all of these things are pretty hard to communicate about. So, you know, we are continually looking to our regional partners and to help develop some of those messages and engagement strategies for all of our projects. So I'll leave it there, and I'll turn it over to somebody else to provide their background.
If we're sticking in the order, maybe I should go next. That work? That's great. I wanted to first say thanks for inviting me to join this panel. I was excited to connect with all of you and to connect with the fellow panelists. And Claire, I had a similar reaction when I looked at the panelists you were joining, but maybe for a slightly different reason, because I formally studied communication, but I saw that we were a really interdisciplinary group, and I was excited to connect with community partners, because in the work that I've been doing, I feel like I've learned as much, if not more, about what it means to communicate from and with the community members that I've been working with. It's really been completely transformative for both my scholarship and then, you know, communication activities and praxis. So just excited to be talking with all of you and learning from you as well today. So again, my name is Bridie McGreavy. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of Maine. And I'm also a faculty fellow with the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. As Allie mentioned, my work typically falls within 3 contexts, and I'll briefly describe each of those. But more broadly, I tend to take an engaged research approach, increasingly drawing from decolonizing methodologies as well, so that I'm working with community members at all phases of the research process, starting at the earliest phases, you know, in the research question formation. If we're writing a grant, really collaborating with them deeply to make sure that whatever we're proposing is going to be meaningful, checking in throughout the process to just provide updates and redirect as needed, and then find multiple ways to share whatever knowledge or research products come out of it at the end. So in continual dialogue in my research processes. My fields are interdisciplinary. Much of my work fits within rhetoric as a communication studies tradition and environmental communication, but I also do a lot of work in sustainability science and collaborate with people across disciplines as well. In terms of the 3 contexts, the first area that I've been doing the majority of my work for the longest period of time focuses on coastal resilience. You may have heard Allie say the word shellfish. A lot of my work is all shellfish, all clamming, all the time. This started for me in my dissertation. I was working with a group called the Frenchman Bay Partners, and they were doing a conservation action planning process, and they wanted to engage with the 70 or so clam harvesters who had organized into this 7-town regional cooperative, where they were basically figuring out, how do we manage the shellfish resource? How do we sustain it into the future? I grew up in Maine, but I had no idea about what was going on in coastal communities and within clamming communities. It became my responsibility as part of my role with this group to show up at their meetings and just listen to what they were talking about, the kinds of questions that they were raising, and what then would be meaningful for this conservation plan. And in showing up at these meetings, I just found myself stepping into a world where, you know, clammers were communicating across difference and self-imposing restrictions on themselves to try and sustain not just the resource, but a way of life into the future. And I really got hooked on that. I was compelled by the work that they were doing, a lot from it. And I've stayed involved with that specific organization, the Frenchman Bay Regional Shellfish Committee, but over the last 10 years or so, it's expanded into broader efforts across the state because Maine manages its shellfish resources part of what's called a co-management system, which is a partnership between Maine 74 or so coastal municipalities that have a shellfish resource and ordinance, and the Maine Department of Marine Resources. So I've been shaping my communication research to try and support learning, leadership, and equity across both the Maine co-management system and increasingly working with Wabanaki tribal nations, including the Passamaquoddy tribe at Spike and the Penobscot Nation. So that, I think, feeds into the next area of my work, and that focuses on river restoration and social and environmental justice. Most recently, I was involved in a project funded by the National Science Foundation called The Future of Dams, where I was bringing communication research to bear on understanding how communities were making decisions about a whole host of dam removal options, and trying to come up with workable solutions, whether it's to remove a dam or to put in some kind of retrofit or an energy upgrade or fish passage, the ways in which communication shape those kinds of deliberative processes. So I've been doing, in terms of the focus on river restoration, social environmental justice, I've been doing a lot of work with 3 out of 4 of the federally recognized Wabanaki tribes, Penobscot Nation, the Passamaquoddy tribe, the Sabayak, and the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, doing engaged digital media to document and share what water means to the tribes, but also the ways in which they're leaders on river restoration and stewardship. And then the third area of my work focuses on these large, sustainability-focused transdisciplinary collaborations. And the most recent one that I've been involved in is called the Maine Environmental DNA Project. And my role on these projects is, as a social scientist, to study the collaboration and communication dynamics, and in as close to real time as I can, feed information back to the ongoing emergence of these collaborations to try and strengthen them, especially as it relates to processes like information sharing and equity. So I'll leave it there. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Following the same sort of schedule of speakers here, following our introductions, I'm Carol Miller, and I am very, very happy to be here. And I really want to thank GLEAR and Rust. This is really wonderful how you're bringing together Wayne State University and Windsor for this series. I really hope that this grows into something even bigger. It's just so obvious that we should be doing this. You stand at the Detroit River and you can look over to Windsor. You can actually see the University of Windsor. So we need to collaborate more and more. And thank you so much for allowing me to be here. And this is going to be fun, listening to the bios of all the other panel members here. I think we're going to have a lot to talk about. So the question is, provide more detail on your organization. Well, so many ways you can look at that, right? I'm from Wayne State University. That's one of my organizations. I'm from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Wayne State University. I direct Healthy Urban Waters at Wayne State University, which is a transdisciplinary collaboration of researchers across the campus, especially focused on water and water-related issues within the Huron to Erie corridor. So that would include the Detroit River, the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, and as most of you probably know, that corridor is the drinking water resource for more than 4 million people in the United States and Canada. So although it's a relatively narrow swath of waterway, it provides an incredible resource in terms of freshwater drinking for both the US and Canada. So Healthy Urban Waters is one of the groups that I probably spend most of my time with. But in addition, Wayne State University has recently started a new initiative, which is tagged One Health at Wayne State, One Health at Wayne. And as part of that, we are increasing, I would say, the transdisciplinary nature of the research and collaboration that takes place at the university. including the medical college, the law school, business school, and all the other groups that have traditionally been involved in environmental research. So that has just been kicked off just a few months ago. We're in the process of awarding some pilot projects to really seed this whole One Health initiative, and I hope I get a chance to talk a little bit more about that. Just continuing on organization, I need to give a real nod to Dr. Donna Cashin for leading the RUST program. I am one of the co-investigators on that, and I think that that program has done tons to lift the broad nature of environmental research, not just at Wayne State, but across the border to Canada and among other states. And it's really facilitated transfer of information, both directions, from researchers to the community and the community to researchers. And so that has been a very significant organization that I've been involved in over the last few years. In terms of my personal research areas of interest, I started out as a hydraulics engineer, very focused on pipes and pumps and water treatment plants and those sorts of things, very much an infrastructure person, a traditional civil engineer, professional engineer, and so on. But in my PhD, I expanded more into more of the natural resources of water. So I got much more involved in groundwater and rivers, very involved in rivers and flooding of rivers and dams. I hope to talk to Bridie a little bit about that. I've done a lot of work in sedimentation behind reservoirs and dams. So more recently, I'd say my interest in water has been more field interest than simply focused on infrastructure and water flowing through man-made objects. And that's really, really been a very fun leap, I think, to go through. In terms of funding organizations that I've been involved in, many of the same that we've already heard about, National Science Foundation. As I've broadened my research to work with the medical school, I've been much more involved in the National Institutes of Health. I've been very involved with the Corps of Engineers on projects related to dams, reservoirs, harbors, ports, and so on. Our group, Healthy Urban Waters, really is funded at the federal level as well as the local level. In terms of engaging communities, that is huge. And again, that's one of the things that I hope to learn more about today. I'm definitely not an expert in communication. What do they say? Engineers can barely talk. So I'm an engineer and I'll learn from some of the communication experts. Luckily, I've got Allie, who's a communication PhD student, and I work very closely with her advisor, Dr. Rahul Mitra. But communication, I think in some ways, and you folks may disagree, I think some of it you certainly can learn on the job. And I've been kind of around for a long time, and I've learned a lot. I've done a lot of things wrong the first time I've tried them, but I've really learned from what people who know more have told me regarding ways to approach the community, ways to work with the community, not to talk to the community, to learn, to hear. And it's finally coming through to me, and I hope I can share some of the experiences that I've had recently with Healthy Urban Waters and RUST that have really exemplified the advantages from that multiple paths of communication. Just to mention one thing that has worked really well for us in terms of communicating with the community, I would say one thing that we tried this past year is taking our Water at Wayne seminar series, sort of on the road. Obviously, we're doing it virtual now, which means people don't have to travel to Wayne State, and that's really great. But a year and a half ago or so, right before COVID, we started, rather than having Water at Wayne, which is sort of our Keystone seminar series to talk about water issues in the community and the region, it had always been at Wayne State University, which is for some community members a hassle to have to drive, to find parking, pay for parking, and all that sort of stuff. So we should have had this idea long before, but we decided to take Water at Wayne on the road. So we have been to churches, we have been to fellowship centers, recreation centers, providing these talks, and that has been really a wonderful way to meet with the community where it's convenient for them and not for us. With that, I think I'm going to pass it on, and again, I really look forward to the rest of this discussion today.
Thank you all so much for having me. My name is Justin Onwenu. I'm an environmental justice organizer for the Sierra Club, and I'm based in Detroit. I got started in this work from a public health interest in public health. So I originally wanted to go to medical school to help address, racial health disparities. And I think for me, I started to realize in the aftermath of a hurricane that hit in Houston, Texas, where I was going to school, that the environments people live in, their access to clean air. I mean, in Houston, after the hurricane, there were refineries and toxic waste facilities that flooded. And so I think that experience exposed me to how the environment can shape health, and especially racial health disparities. The Hispanic and Black neighborhoods in Houston were particularly hard hit because of redlining and their close proximity to all of these sorts of facilities. And so for me, that was the turning point when I started deciding to focus more on environmental justice and just recoveries after hurricanes and climate change and how that interacts with existing inequalities. I now work for the Sierra Club, which is a national organization, but I'm based in Michigan. And my focus areas are, again, traditionally public health focused, so things like clean air, clean water. And I'll go over a couple of the initiatives we're working on. So I think one of the pressing issues that has popped up, it popped up late in 2019, early 2020. There was a piece of contaminated land contaminated with PCBs, uranium, and all sorts of other nasty chemicals that collapsed into the Detroit River and separates Detroit from Windsor. And it was a Canadian newspaper in Windsor that actually reported the news first. That I think it was the Windsor Star that notified American residents and Canadian residents that this site, which has historically been contaminated, collapsed into the river. And so my job, and working with a lot of other community partners, was to try to put together an emergency response. So to sort of ask questions like, what do we know? What don't we know? What sort of policy gaps allowed this incident to happen? What are the threats to our drinking water sources and to the Great Lakes? The Detroit River is a place where people recreate and fish and do all sorts of things. And so making sure that that water source was protected was a top priority. And so since then, what we've been focusing on is trying to address the gaps that we identified early on at each level of government. So at the federal government, advocating for more funding for Great Lakes cleanup and Detroit River cleanup, which has been primarily led by folks like Congresswoman Lawrence of Detroit. At a state level, we've been working to hold the company accountable. So fines have been issued. We've been working to make sure that the site is secure. And then at a local level, there's an ordinance that we're working to pass called the Detroit River Protection Ordinance, which basically seeks to require things like, regular inspections of properties along the river. Just given how industrial Detroit's riverfront is, there are a lot of areas that are of concern if they, collapsed or were exposed to the river. So inspections, accountability. So, property owners that aren't taking proper care of their property should be held accountable. And the last is strengthening emergency protocol and procedures. One of the things that happened in the aftermath of that incident is that, a lot of residents had questions. There were concerns about drinking water sources. There was a lot of testing done by, the FBI, Eagle, the state level environmental agency, all sorts of different the EPA and all sorts of different agencies. So making sure that in the aftermath of an emergency that has to do with the Detroit River, that government agencies are talking to each other and doing the proper testing to make sure that people have confidence. So protecting drinking water sources is part of my work. And I would say the other part that relates to water is supporting being in a supporting capacity for groups like We the People, the People's Water Board. There are a lot of groups based in Michigan that focus on water justice. So making sure that everybody has access to clean and affordable water. And this has been particularly important during the coronavirus pandemic, where government officials are saying, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. But for a long time, people haven't had regular, certain communities haven't had regular access to water, clean water. So making sure that in the long term that water is kept on for people, that it's made affordable, that we're at a state, federal, local level, making the investments so that water can be affordable and accessible. And that work primarily is being led by, great community organizations, like I said, like We the People of Detroit. And so just supporting that work as well. I'll also just say that, part of my work has to do with air pollution, in particular, working with community members and activists who have been impacted, whether it be on a health level. One of the things I say to folks is that environmental justice is so important to me because it connects to so many other issues. So if you live right next door to a hazardous waste facility, your home is probably not going to be worth as much as it would otherwise. And, especially in the States, home equity is how people, build wealth, pass that down to their kids and grandkids. And so if the facility is moving in right next door to you or expanding or polluting, that impacts your pocketbook just as much as your health. Also impacts school performance. So, kids who learn in polluted environments are not going to have the same education outcomes as they would if they were learning in a healthy environment. And of course, things like healthcare, spending money for asthma and cancer and emergency room visits. So I think air pollution, and I think water pollution, I think environmental justice is so important because it's a foundational issue that touches on so much and so many other issues. I think the last thing I'll say is that this work, wouldn't be possible and is not possible at all without directly working with impacted communities, allowing them to lead, to tell their own stories and to talk about how they've been impacted by pollution and environmental justice. And I think that people are starting to realize that for a long time, communities have been sounding the alarm on these issues. And so, people who are impacted have the expertise, whether there are credentials or not, as we traditionally think about them. I like to think that directly impacted communities are the experts, top experts on all of these issues. So working with folks who have that expertise, who've had that personal and life experiences, I think is at the foundation of the Sierra Club's work and my work as well. So thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you. I want to, just extend another thanks again for your kind of extended introductions into your work. We're going to move on into a few of the other questions that we already have prepared for the panel. So we'll make sure that they pop up on the screen too, in case you need a reminder. But our next question, and I think Justin provided a really nice segue, is how have you used communication as a research tool and or topic? And really, what is the value of communication in your work? How can good communication further the goals of both researchers and community stakeholders? And so whoever wants to jump in can just go right ahead.
I start again? I'll start again. I'm at the beginning, or we could rotate. I don't know, whatever anybody would like to do. I don't have a huge amount to say on this, so I'll start. And, you know, I really appreciated Justin's comments there. And the Detroit River really holds a special place in my heart because I spent 5 years working on that project and the cleanup of the river with a number of researchers who are also on the phone or on the call today. And, you know, I got to tell a lot of the good stories, you know, other than the one that Justin just mentioned about the, the river slumping in and the PCBs. But there are so many good stories about the Detroit River, you know, and the cleanup over the last 50 years. And, you know, I got great experiences. I got to go out with researchers and see what they were doing and be able to tell their stories. And, you know, that was not only important for my own career, but it was, you know, I think important for the story of the Detroit River and talking about, you know, our role as stewards of our water. And so, you know, when I take that experience and try to translate it to the work that I'm doing within climate change, you know, climate change is, you know, as we've already heard today, it's multidisciplinary, it's cross-boundary, transboundary, cross-generational issues. And not only are the impacts felt really broadly and, you know, again, to Justin's point, very much inequitably as well, you know, across the region or across the population, but the solutions are often also embedded into every single sector. So whether that's, you know, how we get around, how we use our energy and our resources, you know, those adaptation actions that we need to be seeing industry. So, you know, obviously in order to see this sort of broad, urgent action that we need to see at scale and speed that the climate crisis is calling for, you know, it's critical that we have good communication between all of those pieces and all of those partners. So, and I think as we're seeing as a region and as we're starting to have more of these conversations like we are today, you know, these partnerships and cooperation make us competitive for funding as well and business development and all of those pieces that are so critical to you know, the just transition of clean energy and all of those kinds of things, which benefits everybody. And of course, you know, this webinar today is of course a great example of that. So I don't have much more to say than that, except that, you know, we recognize the critical importance of it and value these opportunities to speak with partners, you know, transboundary partners and, you know, multidisciplinary partners as well.
So I would just say, I think from my role trying to influence policy, I think narrative and communications is just so important. Humans, we all learn by listening and telling stories. And I think being able to provide good narratives and communications framing is the only way that good policy gets done. I think an example of that is we've seen for a long time, environmental justice communities emphasize the need not just for a reduction in emissions and pollution in our communities, but also for money to be invested directly. I mean, because the communities that have been, you know, traditionally burdened with pollution are the ones that have been disinvested in. And you've also seen people, so you've seen people talk about health, you've seen people talk about climate, and you've seen people talk about jobs, all, you know, in different ways over many years, but it's only until recently, I think, where people are starting to see those things as kind of an all or nothing, very connected. And I think that has to do with communications and framing. I also think just transition is another example of a term and a communications framing that people have been emphasizing for a long time, is that is starting to get popular and being used now. The idea that, you know, we can't just transition to solar and wind and a green economy without making sure that the workers and the communities where, you know, steel plants and coal plants, where those reside, that they're also taken care of. And so I think communication is just so important. I think I've also just personally used op-eds and media as a way of moving policy. I think one of the examples I'll use is that in the Detroit River incident that I mentioned, we had a press conference outside of City Hall, And there was a city official that I was trying to get in touch with earlier in the day before the press conference, just to get an update on, where they stood on the ordinance and, how things would go as it related to the incident. And, couldn't get a call back, calls were being ducked. And it wasn't until, later on in the day when news clips started to come out. And one of the things that all of the news clips had was a picture of all of us standing in front of kind of City Hall. And there was a sign that I didn't even think anything about at the time, but the sign said, "We're watching you, City Hall," in big, bold, orange letters. And, all of the news agencies ran that picture. And it wasn't until, those clips started coming out that I got a call that was like, "Well, we saw, a sign that you all said, we're watching you, and, we'd love to work with you. Why are you putting this in the media? We're standing with community on this issue." And so I just use that as an example of the fact that policymakers pay close attention to what narratives are emerging, and we certainly use media to pressure political officials and to make sure that people are doing the right thing. So I think communication is so important.
Well, go ahead.
You sure? Okay. So despite being a faculty member in communication, I actually came to communication somewhat late in my career. I worked for about 15 years or so at a nonprofit watershed organization. I think maybe similar, Claire, to the organization that you're working with. And I have a master's degree in environmental studies. And I had a number of experiences both at the nonprofit organization and then doing this master's degree in environmental studies, where I came to be just deeply interested in communication, because communication was just at the heart of these like complex conservation and justice related challenges that I saw communities grappling with. So in terms of the master's research, I did some work on wetland conservation and realized that municipal officials were making decisions with really limited information. I mean, they were interested in gaining access to the science so that they could make more informed local policy, but it just wasn't available to them. And I was also at the same time involved in a community water justice effort related to large-scale groundwater extraction, so basically the bottled water industry, where Nestle has a pretty strong presence in Maine, has a number of different extraction wells. And I participated in a number of public hearings where Nestle is proposing these extraction sites, and just watch these communities just fall apart, essentially. Just the level of conflict over, those who were concerned about the extraction activities and the sustainability of the groundwater, and those who were concerned about, rural poverty and the need for jobs. And I thought there has to be a different way here. There has to be a way of setting up these public participation processes so that people can communicate across these differences and really grapple with the complexity of the issues and come up with workable solutions, not panacea type solutions, but things that are really going to be meaningful and transformative for these communities. So that is really what motivated me to get a PhD in communication. And I wanted to pick up on a word that I heard Justin use, because in all the work I've done on communication, I come to feel that listening has to be one of the most important communication skills and commitments. And it in part relates to a point that Justin, I heard you raising about showing up in these communities and listening to what they know is essential for being able to do anything that's going to be workable. These community members have essential knowledge that needs to be part of the mix for any kind of solution that we might come up with. And I use that term solution carefully, because it also can be totalizing and problematic. But the thing with listening too is that what listening means, if you type in listening into a Google search, you'll see really big ears, right? Or the sense that listening is a passive activity. As long as we're nodding and giving good eye contact, we're listening. But learned a lot about how listening is ecological, that like what listening is going to be different from place to place. And it's in like the fine-grained practices of like, did you record what somebody was saying accurately in the meeting minutes? And did you then share that back with them so that they had an opportunity to say, yes, you got it right, or no, you didn't? Or, you know, just like touching base continuously, showing up in their places, listening as that embodied practice of, you know, being there in shared spaces. And so studying communication, I think, has helped open up my sense of what it means to listen and to listen well.
Thanks. I think I'll just emphasize a couple of those points I've already heard. I heard Bridie talking about reporting back or communicating back, completing the circle, circling back to the community. If you're doing some work in the community, whether it's research, actually analytical research or survey research, field work, whatever, and the community has been gracious enough to allow you to take samples or to do some surveying, they want to hear back from you. They don't want that to be something that is just a, you know, lost in space sort of thing. And we've, you know, the more and more that we put that into place and keep the community in the loop and involve them in every step, the more willingness there is within the community to share information, to share sampling sites and so on and so forth. So I think that circling back, it's just obviously critical. The other thing that I'd mention regarding communication is that it's so important to understand different meanings of words. And some of that has already come up, but I was thinking of a really simple example that has kind of taken over some of our research recently. We're doing a lot of work in urban flood mitigation, whether you can use green stormwater infrastructure to help reduce the impact of flooding in some of the Detroit communities, or whether there's other approaches that are more important. But one of the things that keeps coming up is the use of the term flood. I mean, when you know, traditionally flood to you know, to many of us, that we just think of water. That is a flood. Okay, too much water is a flood. But if you're trying to really understand what's causing that water and how to remediate that water, you need to know so much more. Is the flood, is it coming from a backed up sanitary sewer? So you're getting E. coli in your basement, and maybe it's even during dry weather. That's one type of problem. You may have combined sewer issues, so that during wet weather you have both storm and sanitary sewage coming into your basement. Or you may have flooding in your home because your roof has a leak and water is coming directly into your home and going down the walls. You may have leaking pipes in your home. You may have the river water level is rising, you know, the Detroit River. How does that impact the flooding? So one of the things we're working closely with some colleagues at U of M is designing a survey that, you know, really allows the community members to give additional information about the type of flooding. You know, is it in their basement? Is it, how deep is it? Does it go to the top of their toes? Does it go up to their knees? You know, questions like that, so we can really understand. And I think, yeah, I think, you know, what was Adrienne Rich's poetry book, "And Dream of a Common Language," I think is something that really would help our communication.
Well, no, whether the leak is coming from before. Jerry,
So jumping off that point, kind of, our next question,
on an agenda.
what are the barriers in connecting researchers and their work to communities that would benefit from it? And what can scientists / early career researchers do to tackle these barriers?
you know, the things that we can offer them agency
So,
wise.
so I'll just say that one of the things I forgot to mention in my early intro was that my first job out of college was working for the Children's Environmental Health Initiative, which used to be at the University of Michigan, then moved to Rice University. And my job essentially was to try to get people to share their experiences about the Hurricane Harvey, how it impacted their life, how it impacted their health, their housing, economic status and situation. And for me, I think one of the takeaways from that experience that I have is that it's so important for building trust that people understand what the connection is between the research and the outcome, the injustice, the policy, whatever you're studying. I think particularly with work that is social justice oriented, that sometimes there's this assumption that simply getting the data is what will lead to a change in what's being researched or studied. And I hope that that we start to take a more ambitious model and approach to that thinking. There are groups, you know, at a local level, certainly, and folks like Dr. Paul Mohai, who's a giant in the environmental justice field, who aren't just focused on gathering the data, but making sure that that data is given to nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups and residents, because so often one of the barriers, I mentioned that impacted communities are experts. One of the issues that I see in the environmental justice field is that, you know, people for a long time have been saying that pollution is making me sick, whether it be asthma or cancer, but it oftentimes isn't until, you know, an academic is able to say, we have verified with XYZ statistics that those voices are taken seriously. And so I think there is a huge role for researchers to be validators on things that people are already saying, to use your platform and prestige, you know, to amplify the voices of people who've been, you know, screaming at the top of our lungs for a long time. I also just think that there needs on the front end to just be an aggressive approach to sharing this data, so that advocacy groups and folks who are interested in long-term policy solutions and change can make use of it. So I think those are the two things that come to mind for me. I think just making sure that that's on the front end, and when those two things are addressed, I think those barriers tend to come down. There's trust that develops, and I think, you know, trust is the biggest barrier between researchers and the communities that benefit from the research that you all are doing.
I think I have something that can follow on this. Excuse me. So working in an academic institution, one of the barriers that is commonly emphasized is the institutional incentives or mechanisms. So there's a pretty substantial literature that focuses on how tenure review processes are a barrier for doing this kind of work. And I think that's important, and that there needs to be institutional change around those kinds of review processes, and figuring out ways to really meaningfully support and incentivize researchers to do this kind of work. But I think one of the other major barriers is related to the institutional review board processes and how research ethics are regulated at academic institutions, where the history of research regulation is really coming out of biomedical sciences and psychology. And so there's an emphasis on the benefit of the research. So when you put in an IRB proposal to propose any kind of social science or engaged research, you have to be able to identify, you know, the so what factor, essentially, of like, what difference is this going to make to knowledge and to society and hopefully to the community. There's a heavy emphasis on respect for persons. And so this is where you see the focus on informed consent processes and making sure that, you know, confidentiality is maintained. And then there's also supposed to be an effort towards justice, and that's really underspecified in IRB review processes. Like, what does justice really mean in a research process? And what does it mean to really do this kind of work ethically? So getting to Justin's point about, data sharing and data management and making sure that communities have an ability to weigh in on data collection and analysis processes, and that the data are shared back with them, that they ultimately own these data if that's appropriate and that's something that they want. And so we've done some work at the University of Maine to try and push on our IRB and research regulation process, especially as it relates to research with indigenous tribes, where we're setting up protocols for joint management and ownership. But there's a lot more that needs to be done at our institution, I think other institutions across the country, where I've come to see, I don't see my work as human subjects research. I would never refer to the people that I'm working with as human subjects. And then it's viewed in that way, and I find it to be an ill fit, and it's really a constraint.
Thank you.
I can jump in just very quickly, and I would just emphasize something that I heard from Bridie in the previous question, and Justin as well, about listening. And I think it's this right here is what scientists and early career researchers can do, is invite us to the conversation and invite the practitioners and the people on the ground to the conversations, ask what they need. I was going through these lists of questions yesterday and trying to figure out how to answer this one. And I was at the same time in a meeting with Dr. Febria and a couple of farmers about a panel that we're hosting next week. And I heard her say, we're both presenting on this panel. I heard her ask, the farmers, is this what you think they want to hear? Is this what you think, would help further the conversation and the discussion? And I was like, oh, that's what that's what good research is asking those people on the ground what they need. And every time we have a conversation with people implementing on the ground, or the landowners or whatever, we discover a new barrier. Every time we have a conversation, we discover a new barrier. So I think we can't discover those barriers and overcome them unless we start having those conversations and directly engaging them from the beginning and from the ground up, which we're really seeing with Dr. Febria's work out of a Healthy Headwaters lab.
I guess, yeah, the only thing I would add when I was thinking about what works, and the terms that keep coming up for me are empathy and sincerity. I know that before COVID, again, on this flood mitigation project, when we were, IRB approved, doing these surveys in people's homes, and people who were gracious enough to let us in to ask them about issues in flooding. And we did this in neighborhoods that we knew were having problems with flooding. It was extremely important not to simply, stick to the script and, we need this answer and that answer. These people had stories, and it just amazed me, how they, not in all cases for sure, but some people really just wanted to tell their story. They didn't want, they wanted you to know, how did this impact getting their kids to school? How did this impact their ability to cook dinner if everything was flooded out? And I don't know, that was just something that I really took away, is just, listen, but not just listen to the technical or the details about the issues that you thought were going to be important to these people. There might be other issues you didn't even think of that are being impacted by some of these environmental problems.
Great, thank you. I want to just extend our thanks again to all of the panelists, but we're at about an hour. So I just want to put a reminder to anyone of our listeners. If you do have questions for the panel, you can go ahead and put them into the chat for Galara and Chelsea, and they'll pass them along. We did have this fourth question here, so I will, I guess we'll kick off our Q&A session with that if you want to touch on that briefly, and then we already got some questions rolling in from our audience that we'll certainly like to ask. So we'll leave this last question here for you before we kick off into the Q&A, but I think it's just, I guess anything, an extension of question number 3, but what particular skills do you think are critical for early career researchers for engaging in the type of work that you do? And beyond what you've already shared, just general advice for students and researchers who are looking to engage in similar type of work and who are wanting to, make these discussions more impactful and effective for everyone. So anything in addition to what you've already shared, and then like I mentioned, we will move on into our Q&A.
I'll just say it. I think listening is, I think it was mentioned earlier, listening is the number one thing for me. I think, especially for environmental issues, people aren't going to say, I care. People aren't going to say explicitly, this is my number one issue, at least in the communities that I work in, but people will say, I care about, the amount of money I'm paying for healthcare. I care about how my kids are doing, and, do they have a safe playground to play in? And so I think listening to what people are saying in terms of what they care about, what their priorities are, and then figuring out on the back end, how are they connected to the issues that I'm working on, or the injustice that I'm trying to address, I think is what I try to do. People say I'm concerned about jobs. So my job is to think about what are the connections between the work that the Sierra Club does and, job creation in the economy. So I just think that listening and being willing to be flexible around language, around the terms that you use may not be the terms that other people you're working with use, and so just I think that becomes a little bit more clear with listening. So I think that's the main skill that I will say is important for researchers, for grad students, and for activists who are working in this field.
Thank you, Justin. I'm going to go ahead and jump into some of the questions that have come from our audience while you all were speaking. So I'll start with our first question. This comes from Kate, but her question is, how important is advocacy in addressing issues relating to exposure to environmental hazards? Should everybody be an advocate? Should the researcher be the advocate?
I'll jump in very quickly on that one, because on advocacy, that's very challenging, and of course it all depends on what agency, what organization you come from, if you have tenure perhaps or whatnot, and we I think sometimes struggle, from and how much you can advocate. But one of the other I think questions that you had potentially posed to us was around where was it? Let me just not skills, but how do you gauge your success and improve awareness of this work? And there's just lots of room for everybody, I think, in these issues, and I think finding ways to keep climate change sort of on the public radar is really, really important. And I think forming a network of people who can communicate particular issues and push them out is becoming really critical. We might not be able to say everything we want to say, but there are people in the community who can. So having these tight networks where you can provide information to be pushed out, I think is important, and some of the ways we've found getting around sort of what we can and can't advocate for.
Yeah, I can give a similar example, maybe an extended example. And I think this is a really important question. I don't feel like I have a clear answer or response to it because it's one that I'm continually grappling with. Like, what is my role as an advocate? Because on the one hand, the mission for the Maine Shellfish Learning Network is to promote learning, leadership, and equity in Maine and Wabanaki wild clam and mussel fisheries. And it's very deliberate, the emphasis on the wild clam and mussel fisheries, because these are fisheries that where there are some real power disparities. Like if you think about Maine, one of the first associations you might have is lobster, right? Which is a $500 million industry. Well, the clam fishery is the second largest fishery, but it's much smaller at $15 million a year. And so those just the resource disparities play out in really direct ways in these communities and create social hierarchies. So our organization is really trying to amplify and support a fishery that is in many ways shaped by rural poverty. And there are some tensions not only between the clam fishery and lobster fishery, but emerging technology around aquaculture, which is an important part of like a diversified mix of fisheries on the coast. Like this has to be part of what we have in the future to meaningfully respond to climate change. But again, those who are getting to aquaculture and are usually in a better position financially and to be able to navigate the permits. And so there are just these tensions amongst these fisheries. And I had an organization that is really concerned about aquaculture's impact on the lobster fishery and also potentially on the shell fishery reached out to me earlier this week and asked me to serve on their advisory board. They're coming out really against what they describe as large shellfish aquaculture. But what I'm trying to do in this organization is still try and create and convene spaces and processes where people can like engage across these differences and work towards equitable solutions. And so in that case, I said, I need to learn more about your organization before I can like formally agree to be a part of it, because I want to make sure that, I'm able to maintain the mission of our organization and not be compromised in that by aligning with a very distinctly advocacy-oriented organization. So it's a tightrope that I feel like I'm continually walking.
I think I am a believer that, not everyone has to do the work that I do. I think we have artists who are activists, we have researchers who are activists, we have, people who organize full time. So I don't think it has to look the same to be called advocacy. But I do think it's important for researchers to be advocacy minded. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're the one organizing town halls or giving public comment, but I think it means just thinking about why you're doing the work and understanding that ultimately, your research and your work being used to change things for the better should be some motivating factor. And so again, I don't think that means that the researcher or the professor has to be up front, but I think it means that it's important for you all to think about, how to work best with communities, whether that's sharing data or, using the research that's in research terms that may not be accessible and trying to make it more accessible through op-eds and things like that. So I think there are ways of getting out the findings and the important work that you all are doing without necessarily, being out front. But I do think that being justice oriented and justice minded is important, but we all will do that in our own different way and unique way. So.
Yeah, I guess I would say I would just agree with what all the rest of the panelists have said. I'm not sure there's a lot to add. I guess some words that become very important to me are informed advocacy. I think the advocacy becomes so much stronger when it's extremely well informed. And I would also suggest that I think people tend to become more advocates as they understand the relationship of their work to the human condition. And I know in engineering, as in the last few years, we've been adding much more of public health focus to a lot of the things that are done in engineering, I noticed that the students are much more, I'd say much, more vocal advocates about various issues like climate change and so on, because they just understand it better.
Can I just jump on that really, really quickly? Because I really like that as well. Came across a quote a few weeks ago that said, people don't share policy papers, they share things that move them. And I just found that so meaningful. And, the way we're trying to start using popular culture or social media or whatever it is, or art, to allow people to engage in their own terms in more accessible ways. Like, I saw this great TikTok of this this woman putting on her makeup, like she was literally like putting on eyeliner and talking about carbon sequestration technology. It was amazing. I was like super engaged in it. So, like there are a lot of different ways to engage in, and it doesn't have to look the same for everybody. So.
All right. So this next question is specifically for Justin. So it's, how important do you think it is for researchers from outside a community, especially white researchers working in communities of color, to explicitly acknowledge their limited perspective due to privilege when starting new research relationships? This seems to be an important elephant in the room that needs to be acknowledged for trust building to be possible. Do you agree, or do you think this explicit acknowledgement of privilege is unnecessary?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think part of the conversation about privilege, I think, just depends on the person. For me personally, I think research in academia is a field that, for a long time, people, there's been reason for mistrust between communities that have been impacted. I think about the medical field, for example, and the relationship in Baltimore between Johns Hopkins and the Black community that surrounds the hospital and the university. And these sorts of relationships exist, in every city. They're oftentimes the forces that are displacing residents are oftentimes, well-off universities. So I do think that, that there is a reason for people to be sort of suspicious of folks who may not be rooted in the community doing research or looking for data and then, not really communicating or working with communities to actually change what has been identified. So I think, a certain level of acknowledgement of that history and that relationship is important. I don't think it's important just to acknowledge it, just to show that, that one's aware of the history and the tension. I think it is important if you're able to say, I know that this is the history. I know that there are reasons for maybe mistrust given, X, Y, Z, but here is how I'm committed to moving and acting in a way that, that aligns with your values. I think that sort of demonstrate, now I think the word privilege oftentimes is used so much. And I always think it's a good thing if it's paired with, and here is what I'm going to do about it, or here is how I'm going to orient myself, or here are my values given, the history and the privilege that I talked about. But I think just based off of the question, I sense that, there are really good intentions behind that. I think just sharing that and making sure people are aware, of how you intend to operate is, I think, will, engender a lot of trust in the community. I will say that I'm going to put hopefully I can put my email in the chat. I would love to stay in touch with you all and ask any questions that you all have after the session. I do have to run just a little bit early. I came down to Alabama to help out with the Amazon union fight, and the vote to decide if they're going to unionize in Alabama is coming up in a couple of days. So have to run, but putting my email in the chat, or if I can't, hopefully Allie can. But thank you all again for having me.
Thank you, Justin. We want to just take a second before you hop off to just extend our gratitude for your time this morning. So, and yeah, I don't think you'll be able to chat to everybody, but we'll definitely make sure that we can share your contact information. So we appreciate that as well.
Great, thank you.
Yep. And we do have about 15 minutes left in our Q&A session, and we've got questions rolling in. So this is a wonderful topic of discussion. So I'm going to pose the next question. Like I said, we've got about 15 minutes left. So what is your general opinion on promoting local media, city radio or TV channels to include discussions or conversations on environmental issues? So this looks like this is from a person on the Windsor side. So it says, in Windsor, we don't have a local TV channel, and on radio, I've never heard a discussion which involved researchers and general audience together on environmental issues.
Well, I'm not sure if you were suggesting that that was a question for the Windsor side mostly. But I would say, yeah, at Wayne State, we have what I believe to be an excellent public radio station, WDET, and WDET does sponsor lots of environmental discussions where they bring in researchers as well as community, and they often hit very controversial topics. So I guess we're very fortunate in that. I would assume that WDET would be very interested in hearing from our Canadian colleagues as well. But just thought I'd toss that perspective in there.
Yeah, I'll jump in very quickly. I don't know how directly, but both the Detroit River project I was engaged with and now with climate change, there's been an opportunity to engage the media. And, I know this wasn't directly the question, but I think a real key challenge for communicators right now is trying to find ways to keep climate change and environmental sustainability on the public radar by equipping media with the tools they need to continue sort of a lasting positive conversation around on the work that's going on. And especially in a time when we're focused really on one crisis, which is COVID, making it clear that we can be concerned about more than one crisis at a time, and sort of the intersection of these crises, I think, are important as well. We know that climate change disproportionately affects, racialized and Indigenous and low-income people, and we can use this as an opportunity to battle that crisis as well. So again, it's these cross-disciplinary conversations, and I agree. Like, I don't think we've seen, especially over the last year or more during the COVID crisis, and we've had a real challenge engaging stakeholders in our mitigation plan because they've been focused on COVID. So it's a challenge, but I think we often, if you've got recommendations on how to better do that, don't hesitate to get in touch with me, because I think we're always looking for ways to better engage our community.
Yeah, and I think it can really add to the diverse mix of ways that people might do engaged scholarship. So there's a sense that, in some cases you might be able to do it all, and showing up at community meetings and building, authentic relationships with community partners and doing that fully engaged research all the way along. And it may have some news media component, but it takes a lot of time, and oftentimes also takes a fair amount of resources to do that kind of work. And if you don't have access to either time or money to do it, news media offers a really great way of staying engaged and helping to connect your research with different kinds of audiences. And I think there's a democratizing influence of the internet here too, where digital media outlets and podcasting and webinars can feed into more traditional news outlets as well, especially if you're deliberate about making those connections. So yeah, I think it's a great option.
Thank you for those great responses. Our next question is, in Dr. Miller's response, she talked about empathy and working with community. I would add authenticity. Does anyone have a defined methodology of approach with the community that makes sure these ideas are used?
So this connects back with another question that was asked earlier about the kinds of skills that you need to do this work. And so for me, one of the important skills that helps cultivate empathy and authenticity is reflexivity. So meaning like reflecting as a social practice, checking in with people, being willing to admit your mistakes. Carol, this is something that you said earlier, that's like, yeah, it's so important to like own when you make a mistake, because you're in many situations going to be working in a cross-cultural type of context, right? And like you may not know the language, or you don't know the specific histories, or you don't know the individual personalities, and you might find yourself in the middle of a tangle that you didn't even anticipate. And so like stepping back and learning from mistakes or failures, and then being able to adjust and grow from that is really essential.
Okay,
I can build on that I guess just a little bit in terms of skills. And again, it's back to something that we were sort of talking about a little bit earlier, is, you know, that human and sort of transparency, I guess, which though maybe those aren't skills, although I guess being human is sometimes a bit of a skill. But also having a passion for storytelling, I think, and finding or finding somebody that can tell your research story and help you connect it to those things. You know, we know that research has shown the benefits of linking climate change to things that people love and need, like clean air and water and food and health and recreation, and, you know, their love of the Great Lakes and whatever else. And remembering your own story, I think, from what engaged you. And for me, you know, in my presentations, and I don't know if it's that engaging, I should probably get some feedback on this, but, you know, I talk about my own daughter, and I've got a picture of my daughter at 3 years old, standing on a black asphalt playground at her daycare. And I remember this is, you know, how I sort of was brought into the climate story through my colleague Karina at the city, who was doing thermal comfort study at playgrounds in Windsor. And the temperatures that she was taking on these playgrounds were astonishing. Like you wouldn't even let your dog on these playgrounds. They were so hot. And so, you know, I look at this picture of my daughter on a black asphalt, and, you know, it's this existential crisis about, you know, what's the world going to be like for her? But it's also about sort of the practical, how do we get trees in her playground? You know, how do we get shade structures? How do we get water into her? So, you know, I think I think as Carol said earlier as well, you know, you can learn on the job. You know, you can learn a lot of this stuff and the ways to communicate this information by drawing on your own experiences as well, and making those cross-disciplinary connections as well.
Okay, thank you. That's actually a perfect connection into our next question. So I'm just gonna hop in with that. And it's, how do you grapple with listening to community members when you yourself are a community member that got involved to advocate for issues you saw weren't being addressed? So I'm not sure if that person is maybe implying like, you know, keeping some type of professionalism or barrier, but yeah, I think that's a good connection to what you just shared.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I'm not positive I know, you know, what the intent of that question was. If you yourself are a member of that community, how do you grapple with listening? I guess one thing I would say is that even if you're a member of that community, I think it's important for you or me to understand you're still going to be able to learn many things that probably, even though you're a member of the community, it's no guarantee that everybody in the community thinks the same, experiences the same. In fact, I would tend to suggest that that's not true. So even if you are a member of that community, I guess you're going to learn a lot by listening to what other people in that community have to say and by sharing your story with them. And I apologize if I didn't understand your question well enough, but that is an interesting question, because I'm sure that comes up a lot, that you know, it's not necessarily a person external to the community that's bringing in information or leading a sharing time or whatever. But I guess it's just everybody's unique. And so even though you're part of that community, there's a lot to be shared.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, I said this earlier, but maintaining those networks and having the data. Again, that's why it's so important to have the data, because you can speak to the data. If I can't speak to the you know, my personal opinion about, you know, what I think, I can speak to the data. This is what the data shows, you know, and we found that really, really important with things like greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know how you're going to debate this. This is what the data shows. What are our next steps? What are, you know, what are the strategies to reduce this? So, you know, and again, having those networks where you can push out information, and you know, I think that also helps with your own mental health during these challenging issues and dealing with these, you know, sort of, again, existential or these global crises you're dealing with every day, is having that network of sort of like-minded people, having students engaged, high school students who can speak on some of this stuff, presenting the information to them and letting them, you know, there's some very, very passionate students around this. So having those networks to be able to share the information, I think, is key.
Yeah, just briefly, I was going to say something really similar. That in addition to networks, I found it's really important to have like a collaborative approach and to be working, if possible, with a team, so that you can check in with them. And I've run into this both in the work in the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, where because I've been working in shellfishing for so long, and I've had leadership roles, I'm part of that community, and also in the research that I do on these transdisciplinary collaborations, where I'm studying the research, but I'm also a researcher who's participating within that. And I need people to check in with to like really, you know, calibrate my observations, and then, you know, make decisions together about what's really going on here and what's going to be meaningful for any kind of communication focused adjustment.
I think this will probably be the last question we can fit in. This is from a social worker with a writing background, and they're working on bringing climate awareness and action into the social worker field. They're wondering what the panelists think are the best ways to engage community members who are not involved in climate change action and help them take action on this issue.
Well, I think a bit of it was just mentioned by a couple of the panelists in terms of making it personal. In other words, pointing out the impact of climate change on things that those, you know, the social worker is working with, the people, the community that he or she is working with, being able to not describe climate change in such a way that it seems like it's, you know, out there, it's other people, you know, we want, but it's more personal. This is what's going on in your community. Did you realize that these sorts of things may be happening? These things, some of them are happening. And so I think, personally, I just think that's the most important, is showing everyday local outcomes associated with climate change.
I would just add to that I suspect anybody in your community who's working on a climate mitigation plan or climate adaptation plan would be happy to have this conversation with you and bring you into the work that they're doing and see how you can help communicate it to your audience as well. Because I think people that do this kind of work are looking for anybody and everybody to bring in to this space right now and get that support and that help and that network. So I would very much encourage you to reach out to the person. I hope it's me, because I need help generally.
Yeah, I don't know that I have really anything to add here, except that I found in some of my work with clammers, I've formed partnerships with pretty hardcore climate denialists. And some of these folks are actually the ones who are on the front lines of what I would describe as climate adaptation. But they're not necessarily doing it because they recognize the science of climate change and that climate change is anthropogenic. They're just concerned about their livelihood and their families and their ability to stay living in this place that they're deeply connected to. And so, again, I think, one of the running themes in this panel is listening and listening to what matters to these communities. And if climate change is not on the forefront, but rural poverty or colonialism or any of these other systemic forms of oppression are, to find ways of connecting and bring our interest in climate change to meet whatever their interests are.
Well, wonderful. We are just at time. So I want to just take a moment and say on behalf of the entire GLEAR and the entire TRUST programs, we want to extend our thanks to all of our panelists, including Justin, who had to hop off, for being here, and to everyone who attended today. So we appreciate all of your answers, taking questions from the audience, and then just for your time. And we want to just give a last reminder that our final seminar of this series will be our Student Research Showcase, and that will take place on April 9th. And we all hope to see you then. I hope everyone has a wonderful Friday and a great weekend. And again, we really appreciate everyone's time.